Hey y'all, I'm Ryan.
And I'm Nanci. And this is Sci-Tea, where we bring you engaging conversations between researchers and practitioners.
We feature leading experts as well as early career researchers in psychology and beyond, who will be speaking with other professionals working in settings such as hospitals, schools, and governmental agencies.
So grab your tea
or drink of choice
and enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to Sci-Tea today, and I'm so excited to start off by introducing my good friend, Andy Godfrey. And Andy Godfrey is an instructor and graduate student at the University of Houston. He studies social behavioral neuroscience and teaches in the psychology department. And a lot of his research focuses on family conflict or violence and the effect that it has on psychological development. And Mr. Godfrey has also spent time as a lab manager for the Personality, Emotion, Brain, and Behavior Lab at the University of Utah. And he has also done research on the different factors that contribute to maladaptive behavior, including various forms of abuse. And he's also interested in individuals' empathetic responses. And he was a huge help to me when I was writing my very first ever grant and really interested in his work. So I just appreciate him as a human and as someone who's on the episode today. So welcome, Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it. And I would like to introduce our other guest, Dr. Debbie Easterling. She is currently a grant writer at My Sister's House, located in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a domestic violence agency providing extensive services, advocacy, and education around interpersonal violence. Debbie is also a volunteer board member for this agency's crisis line and court advocacy sectors. Debbie has earned her PhD in business administration at Louisiana State University. She was a professor, associate dean, and chair of the management and marketing department at Salisbury University. But before that, she was my colleague at Bryant University. We started the same year at Bryant after we got our doctorate degrees. And this is where we first became fast friends. And I'm so grateful that our friendship has continued and grown ever since. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. I'm really pumped that we get to talk about some of Andy's research today. So the specific study that we're looking at, Andy and his colleagues examined the relationship between emotional abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and how specific facets of emotional abuse may relate to PTSD symptom severity for women who have experienced trauma. And so specifically, they were interested in looking at how these dynamics unfold within couples, and they recruited 141 couples with trauma-exposed women who completed self-reports of physical and emotional victimization and perpetration in their current relationship and reported on their own PTSD symptom severity. And so they found overall that about 15% of the variance in PTSD symptom severity was due to emotional abuse, as well as some more nuanced findings around the specific components of emotional abuse that we'll talk through in this conversation. There are a lot of big picture implications from this study, and I'm excited to talk about all of them, but I definitely want to make sure, and Nanci and I want to make sure that y'all feel free to ask each other questions. But first, Andy, I just wanted to see, can you tell us sort of your biggest takeaway from doing this kind of work that you've been doing throughout grad school?
I really started to zone in on some of the specific behaviors that we see in emotional abuse. And really kind of opening up the depth of what intimate partner violence looks like. Because obviously when we think of intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, we think of really intense physical acts against intimate partners, which is absolutely true, it's part of it. But there's a lot of depth to what that can look like from relationship to relationship, as far as the context in which this aggression is happening. So looking at these different aspects of emotional abuse gives us a lot more information to work with regarding the specific environment, what's being said, what kind of actual emotions are being put on to this abuse. So the more specific we can get with it when we're seeing emotional abuse, the better. And we'll talk a bit more about that, what that exactly means. But you just get a lot more information when we start looking at these specific kind of dynamics between partners, as opposed to kind of broadly talking about abuse in a very specific way.
Well, I'm gonna, before I jump in with a question for Debbie, I just want to follow up a little bit on that, Andy, because that is, looking at some of this paper and some of your other work, I just think that what you and your colleagues are doing it's incredibly ambitious and really important, of course. And one of the basic level, I just try to imagine, how do you, getting people to come in, because I know you're having people do not just self-reports, but there is sort of a behavioral component that you're observing with individuals in couples together in a conflict kind of discussion. And that this paper was based on a study based on a larger project, and just logistics, of how do you make room for people to feel that they can actually do something like this. And I know there are some limitations that about safety issues that some people are not included if it's not safe for them to be included. Can you speak a little bit about how you, who the people are that you do collect data from?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So one thing about our collecting data and recruiting individuals for our samples is that there's really no special tricks or kind of nuances to it, because IPV is actually very common, especially when we start talking about these specific emotional abuse dimensions. There's studies showing there's a 12-month prevalence rate of around over 10% for both men and women who've experienced emotional abuse in the last 12 months. So it's really just the community and recruiting individuals who are experiencing a lot of conflict within their relationship. Yes, not everybody meets criteria for our studies, but we find that our samples are more than we're able to get those samples without any problems, because it's just so prevalent. And even speaking to kind of the severe end of that, severe physical violence is still more than people realize. I think the 12-month prevalence rate is somewhere around 2 to 3%, but that's still relatively large in terms of clinical, studies, and relative to if you were doing an experiment with or a study on other populations with psychopathology, that 2 to 3% is actually a decently high number as far as getting that recruitment level. So there's not a lot of tricks to it, because it is very common. Again, especially when we start talking about specifically emotional abuse. And as far as safety goes, that is an important thing. But there's actually interesting studies showing that when we do conduct studies with IPV that include couples, people tend to felt safe doing so. They felt to have found in their relationships that it's beneficial to their relationships in some way. And of course, there are safety measures, making sure that at the end of the study, that individuals feel safe to go home, whether they feel that their interactions during the experiments have caused some kind of increased conflict and risk for any kind of aggression. But with my lab that I'm currently with, Dr. Babcock at the University of Houston, throughout her 30 years of having these studies, she's never had a single incident in which she's had to activate those certain protocols to make sure that people are safe, because it doesn't happen despite having those safeguards to protect participants.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a lot in there what you said. And on the one hand, I think it's sad that the prevalence rates are so high. I'm maybe shocked by it. Probably Debbie won't be, but on the other hand, the fact that people who come in are already maybe feeling some benefit by being a participant, to me, that's very powerful. So that's really powerful. I'm just gonna shift gears a little bit and turn our attention over to our Debbie Easterling and ask you a little bit about My Sister's House and the work that you do and the work that is being done there. If you can fill us in a little bit about that.
Yes, the work that I do is grant writing, so related to fundraising. I write government grants, foundation grants to corporations, local municipalities, I'm not in development. So my background in academia, writing papers and doing research has really benefited me in the work that I'm doing now. Prior to this, I have been a volunteer on the crisis line, and I remain as a backup crisis line counselor. I've also done work in the court system. So we at the agency, we see women that, we see predominantly women that have left the abuser. We have a clinical therapy program for the community where we have over 1,200 participants now in that program, and that occurs on Zoom. And as long as women have access to the internet, they can participate with that. But in our sheltering, we see women that are high lethality cases. So women come in actually injured with broken jaws, with burns, with black eyes, with broken bones, with disabilities from the physical abuse. And physical abuse generally never occurs in the absence of emotional abuse, financial abuse, and isolation. So typically it's gone on for some time when a client comes into the agency, into the shelter with their children. Just to give you an idea of the agency, we typically have close to 400 individuals each year, sheltering individuals. And we currently now have had to close our shelter due to the pandemic. South Carolina has a really high percentage of unvaccinated individuals, and our shelter is closed. We've been closed and open over the past year, but when that happens, we have to shelter our women in hotel rooms. So to give you an idea of that, we have approximately 15 rooms now. Some mothers have up to 3 children, ranging from 14 years down to 6 months. We have several women that have newborn infants in the hotel rooms. We have some Spanish-speaking individuals, and we currently don't have a bilingual staff member. So we are relying on volunteers to help them. So you can just imagine the school situations for the children, how disruptive and unsettling it is. And most of the children, back to Andy's work, where he talked about 4 different dimensions that would lead, 4 different behaviors or phenomena that would lead to PTSD, denigration. Many of these children have experienced that. Intimidation, they've experienced that. They've experienced emotional isolation as well. So that is one of our biggest concerns, our children.
Absolutely. And I think that is really inspiring to me, the kind of work that you're doing from that academic background now, and just applying that those grant writing skills to that area is awesome. And I'm just wondering, sort of in your work around domestic violence, if you've come across or just realized sort of general myths that we have around domestic violence, and maybe who it happens to, or the circumstances, or what it looks like, if you've run into any of those that really stand out in your mind by any chance.
The predominant one is the thought, well, a woman could just leave. That is the number one. Why does she stay? Why doesn't she just leave? We had, I'll just give you a quick example. We typically have an annual luncheon where we're able to have a great guest speaker, someone who's written a book about domestic violence and their experiences. And we had, it was really a high ticket price a couple of years ago. So we had a number of very participants. They were literally shocked that domestic violence happens to anyone that looks like us. That's a myth, that it only happens to certain individuals, and that if a woman wanted to leave, that she could. Why does she stay? So there are lots of misconceptions really around domestic violence. But I have had a woman on the crisis line who was being strangled to death in serial strangulation that would ultimately result in her death. She could barely speak. Her vocal cords had been damaged, and she lived in absolutely the most affluent area of Charleston, South Carolina, in a mansion, but was so isolated and had no access to resources or to other people that she is my prime example of how that misconception is just not accurate.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Difficult realities and truth. And there was a lot in there that you said, Debbie. One thing that I'd like to maybe connect it a little bit to with Andy's work and descriptions of these different domains of emotional abuse, in particular, this idea of isolation, and how powerful that can be. Like I can imagine that woman being so isolated despite the fact that of her living circumstances. And there was, definitely some important associations to that isolation. And maybe we can spend some time talking about it in the both the research realm and also experienced lives. Andy, when you hear this kind of story, I know it's not unfamiliar to you because of who you're working with. And can you maybe talk a little bit more about this particular, or you can talk about other parts of emotional abuse, the different factors, but how does this play out in the couples that you are studying?
Yeah, well, specifically in regards to this study, we can actually look at kind of the weights that these different emotional abuse has as far as their associations with PTSD symptom severity. And what's been shown, not just in this study, but then in other studies as well, is that the restricted engulfment, this idea of cutting individuals off from social ties and other resources, it tends to be the biggest influence, even beyond physical abuse. If we look at what we call the partial correlation in the study, that partial correlation, which is the strength between the emotional abuse and PTSD, it's strongest for restricted engulfment, even relative to physical abuse. So, it backs up, exactly what Dr. Easterling's saying, is that the isolation plays one of the biggest roles in outcomes related to psychological well-being. So it's absolutely congruent with that.
I also think, go ahead. You go ahead. Go, Debbie.
About that do you think that the strength of that association can be explained by just the longevity of isolation? So over time, year in and year out, it is experienced, whereas physical violence, let's say, conversely, there may be several peak incidents, and they almost seem like an aberration to a woman. Like, oh, I don't know how that happened. He just really flew off the handle or whatever. They sort of can explain them away, or do explain them away. So is that a valid interpretation of the results?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I kind of look more into the emotional abuse aspect of it is that there's more like chronicness of the emotional abuse. It's not just like a single incident, right, like you're talking about. This is their day-to-day interactions, how they're really like communicating with each other and forming their interpersonal environment. Actually had this conversation with my advisor, Dr. Babcock, about how it's interesting that emotional abuse is just as strong of an influence or association with PTSD and physical abuse. And she agrees. She said something in the conversation similar to what you're saying, is that when somebody gets hit, they can kind of associate it really with anything, like, oh, like they're having a bad day, or they're a jerk, But when the emotional abuse is chronically at play, it starts to have more context or it gives interpretation to the pain, I guess, in the sense of it starts to build this idea of this is my fault. This is,
Yes.
I'm doing something about this. It puts more, again, context to that emotion, to the pain. And again, with like, if you were hit, you could just kind of blame it on other things or the other person. But the emotional abuse is likely getting in on something more. I talk about this a little bit in the paper of what we call schemas or cognitions of essentially how you view yourself and how you view the world when you're constantly surrounded by individuals who are denigrating you. And especially if you're cut out from other individuals who could give you other feedback otherwise, that you're not an awful person, that this isn't your fault. Cutting off that social ties is just going to kind of isolate you more to this environment that's telling you, that's going to internalize the experience towards you as opposed to putting some blame. And there is some research showing that I think it's beliefs of guilt or fear kind of mediate that association, meaning it causes that, it explains some of that variance between emotional abuse and PTSD. So there is some work on it. It definitely is something to be looked into further of why this exactly has this effect. But I think what you're talking about absolutely is related to kind of, I guess, that mediating factor between emotional and negative outcomes.
Yes.
You're bringing this concept of a sort of acute versus more chronic episodes. Not that the physical abuse can't be chronic, but it also brings up how hard it would be, like, to measure everything, like everything you want to measure. I know that you in your studies collect a lot of data, different kinds of data, and this conversation just speaks to the challenge of trying to get, even when you have a measure, you're measuring a frequency. Do we also get how long, I think it's like in the last year, maybe measure, but has this been going on longer? It's very complex. And I give you and your colleagues a lot of credit for coming up with the best design that is possible without wearing out your participants. Another thing that also comes to mind in this conversation, and I'm kind of forgetting my thoughts, happens to us. Happens to us all. There's just so much in there. Just this idea of if I can go back to isolation again, I feel like that, Debbie is describing people that may, that are in these extreme situations with isolation, and Andy is studying the people. And I wonder how much the people that Debbie is seeing is overlapping with the population that Andy is seeing, and they're related, right? To me, they're not in completely different categories, but I'm wondering if they're in different phases or stages or something like that. And I don't know if we could, answer that question, but would it matter if they were?
I think it would matter. And I wanted to ask Andy about that as well. So I wanted to ask his opinion, actually, whether prolonged isolation and emotional abuse does lead to physical abuse. I can't see that. I would suspect that physical abuse is that something has come before the physical abuse in general. Couples don't usually start out engaging in that kind of behavior with each other. So I think that would be an interesting phenomena to look at. Obviously, I don't think that you could predict a certain time period, but how do you see them related?
I mean, there's absolutely data on psychological aggression, emotional abuse, longitudinally becoming more physical over time. So that absolutely is there, and there's a lot of complexity to that, and still like less research on it because it does require longitudinal data designs, which is it's just a lot more work than just getting a single day assessment, right? It looks focused on requiring people to do stuff over years. There is a really interesting paper by a researcher up in the Northeast, Dr. Kenneth Leonard, I believe, showing that a lot of times abuse does start off kind of more unidirectional, and it turns into more bidirectional over time. I think early on in marriages, there was more direction of violence of men towards women, but that turned into more bidirectional. And it really makes it difficult to talk about it, because we know self-defense violence is absolutely a thing. When we were talking about IPV and these changes over time, and how that is, it just like self-defense based? Obviously, a large chunk of it is, right? But I guess the bottom line is that it's really difficult to, know at this point. But we know that there are changes in time. But even if we know the changes in time, what is the context of that aggression that they're perpetrating? Is it actually some kind of, are they actually becoming more aggressive within of themselves, or are they learning that aggression is the safest reaction to aggression, to defend? It's just hard to understand what that dynamic could even mean. So I guess we don't know yet, or not at least the literature that I've reviewed has those answers, but to say the least, that it's a bit difficult to understand at this point.
I'm really grateful that you, am I cutting you off, Debbie? Do you want to jump in? Because I can come back.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'm so grateful that you brought this up, Andy, because I have to say that even though I haven't read a lot in this literature, it's a topic of interest of mine, and I've done some of my own advocacy and fundraising years ago, actually with Debbie as my mentor. But in the paper, I paused as you were getting into talking about the, sort of this bilateral contribution to abusive emotional abuse. And I paused and I was like, wow, okay. And I just sort of let it sink in. I'm like, okay, well, I'll go back and get in and read it. And I can't close my eyes to it. I try to understand it. And also, what you also mentioned a minute ago is when someone is not just a victim, but perpetrates some emotional abuse to their partner, that has some paradoxical consequences. And I just, I'm like, that's so fascinating, but I don't know what to do with it. Usually a study of findings, to me, it seems like there's a clear message, or like, what will we tell people? What can they do? And these findings are really hard for me to know, what can we do with it? Like, what is the message we want to get, take from the findings that are we can't ignore?
Yeah, I think the complexity is one of the first important findings, is acknowledging that abuse looks different across settings and different relationships, and acknowledging that these different behaviors, and whether it's physical abuse or emotional abuse, all are nuances that are important to consider when thinking about, risk for that. As a clinician, I do a lot of couples therapy, and when you're working with clients, you are making evaluations on the risks of certain behaviors. And so I do think there are a lot of nuances to take into account, and we can talk about like the specific findings that are relevant for each specific one. But essentially in this paper, we did want to look into the nuances about whether the associations between emotional abuse and PTSD symptom severity varied between, unidirectional violence, which is what most people think of, where there's a single perpetrator and a single victim, and this bidirectional violence, which, is a little less talked about. But understanding how that might vary, and more importantly, whether it doesn't vary, is also very important. A lot of varies there. But specifically, I guess the most important non-finding, I think, is that the effects didn't vary for restrictive engulfment and physical abuse. So it doesn't matter if you are also engaging in some kind of level of aggression back. It doesn't matter if you aren't. These effects are consistent across those dynamics, which I think is an important takeaway and to not get caught up in the complexities that restrictive engulfment, that isolating behavior, and the physical abuse were consistent across everybody, really. We didn't really start to get into more nuances until we started looking at some of the other papers like denigration and hostile withdrawal, which do have some more nuances to what that means in regards to the association between emotional abuse and PTSD.
We can go into the James Gross model of emotion regulation stuff if you want. Well, it also just, what Debbie was saying earlier too, just around like sort of the myth of like, why don't people leave? And I was just wondering, and I have no evidence that y'all's lab does this, but it just makes me wonder if you have if any of the studies sort of measure, like have any follow-ups in terms of if people stay in those relationships. And I totally understand why like the longitudinal piece is really difficult, but even just like the piece of like, did these couples stay together for like a year? If I was just curious if any of y'all's studies, like if you end up going back to those couples to see.
Nothing comes to my mind immediately of anything.
That's totally okay. That's just interesting to me too, because it makes me just wonder sort of what do these people's relationships, like you're saying, like the dynamics sort of over time are really fascinating of just how these dynamics could play out in different people's relationships, and if people do stay and how long, if it's these different components of emotional abuse, and just how long these pieces are coming or people are experiencing these different components.
All right. The only literature that, go ahead, Dr.
Another question while you're considering the answer to that one. I was curious about the demographics even of your study, how long couples have been together. That sort of plays into what Ryan was asking about, and whether you found differences between different ethnic backgrounds, and whether you had any LGBTQ couples, or how. I know you would have to have a really large sample to really investigate the differences between couples, but I was curious about that also.
Yeah, we do look at those possible control covariates, things to control for. And in this study in particular, none of those played a role. We always do like a preliminary analysis to see if we should control for differential levels of age, or differences across race or socioeconomic. We did look into that, and the PTSD wasn't related to any of those things. So that's like the important thing, is it related to the outcome variable? We can test if there's differential effects across those, but like you were saying, it does require a larger sample size that we didn't have for this study. But in regards to actual generalizability of these findings, is that our sample was fairly, it wasn't just a white sample, which is what you tend to see mostly. If anything, it was actually quite spread out as far as race and age and socioeconomic background. So yeah, I mean, there is more discussion about like what it means if these effects differ across those, but like, you're mentioning it, we didn't have the sample size to detect those.
I guess I was just curious too, because you were talking about that it's not as difficult to recruit as we might imagine. And I was just wondering what pieces, in terms of just like self-selection of people who are opting into these kinds of studies, if there are pieces that you just sort of think of, because I know we do, like my lab does bereavement research, and there are very clear characteristics of people who can take the time to do like 4 or 7 hour long visits in the middle of the day, kind of a thing, when they've just lost their spouse who might be making that income. And so I'm just wondering if, in y'all's line of research, if there are sort of different self-selection pieces that you sort of think of across the studies, or if you are sort of feeling like you are able to get more of a representative sample for this kind of research.
That's kind of tough to say in this current world, because we actually haven't done a study in a really long time.
Fair enough. Yeah.
There's discussion of like, should we use gift cards over cash, because cash used to be the biggest thing. But there's certain ethical things to consider with cash and gift cards, and I guess I don't really have a good answer for that one, because it's been a long time since Dr. Powcock has brought in. We are about to start a new study, so I guess I could speak to that a little bit more soon. But it is something that absolutely does need to be considered because it is a long time to come in. These assessments last for 4 hours and studied. Sometimes we break them up into 2 assessments, so it does have some selection bias in that, most likely, because not everybody can do that really.
Do you want to take a minute and tell us what the upcoming study is about a little?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll plug in.
We're always excited about future directions.
Right. So Dr. Babcock currently is looking at, well, essentially, I'm going to take a step back. We have couples come in and they have them engage in a conflict discussion. We find something that they both agree about is something that tends to get a little bit emotionally heated when they talk about it. And we have them just talk about that conflict. While they're doing that, we do have them hooked up to physiological equipment to see how their emotional, specifically their autonomic nervous system is firing during that. And we're also videotaping them to get specific observed behavior that we can get that is coded later by research assistants. And then what we do, or at least what's going to happen in this next study, is we test to see if we can apply either an emotion regulation skill or some kind of communication skill to reduce the amount of aggression that's observed during the conflict. So that's what this, and then we have them do the conflict again to see if it changes anything. And then we always, of course, have some kind of control group in there who doesn't get any kind of experimental treatment skill, and to see if if they stay the same while the people hopefully in the treatment skill group change in their behaviors and such. So it does involve couples in which there's been at least one or two acts of physical violence, but we are also kind of widening it to psychological aggression and things like that. So yeah, that's what's, and we're doing this because a lot of the current treatments they show a pretty weak effect size in helping individuals become less violent. So the idea is that we're trying to find specific skills that we can teach individuals to help them be less aggressive with their partners. Because the current ones, just to give you an example, the effect size for the current treatments for violent men is like 0.1 or less than 0.2, which the average treatment for psychological disorders is like 0.8. So it's relative to other treatments. The treatments for individuals who perpetrate intimate partner violence is not very good. So that's why we're doing these specific skill testing, is to identify like specific things that we can actually change about the current treatment modalities.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
That's really encouraging.
Yes.
You had said earlier something about how couples come in and they feel good about coming in, and I'm thinking back to when I had my early teacher training, to teach little kids. They video recorded us, which was like cutting edge at the time. Anyway, and then we got to see ourselves teaching and do some self-correction. And I don't, obviously your study is already designed, but I wonder if that would be positive or negative, helpful or not. I'm just throwing that out there because I can't help myself. Because I think, sometimes I'm in situations like, I wish I could remember all those details. I wish I could remember how I reacted to something. So I'm wondering if that has a potential as a tool at some other point. This study is already designed. Just throwing it out there.
I mean, that's definitely been thrown out there in treatment modalities of kind of monitoring and coaching. So it's definitely something that I think has probably been looked into for sure. Whether it's been done specifically with intimate partner violence, I don't know about that though. That would be
interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. It's come up. I'm wondering we're hearing like a lot about a lot of different studies, and I'm thinking back to the work that you're doing, Debbie, or your colleagues are doing as well, especially providing all these services for people in need. And I know that you can't, when individuals, as you said, primarily women are, in their homes and they haven't left yet, you can't reach out very and directly to support them. But once they come and ask for help, can you see how the ways that these different dimensions that Andy's been talking about and that we were reading about a little bit in the study can can you see how maybe the work that's being done at my sister's house is to sort of build people up again, so they aren't so isolated, that they don't feel so denigrated? I mean, is that part of the mission, part of the work, or how does that play out?
Definitely. We refer to clinical therapy and case management as stabilization services. So average tenure in the shelter, average time in the shelter is 30 to 60 days. And clearly a woman who has been isolated, prevented from working, doesn't have a car, doesn't have savings, prevented from any participation in the family's resources, 30 to 60 days passes pretty quickly. And so the services that we provide are really just to have women be able to reflect and breathe and feel safe. And just that feeling of safety is really important. And until a woman feels safe, she can't really, an individual. We do shelter men as well. It's much more rare that a male victim contacts us, but we have sheltered men and their children. Back to the stabilization services, it is required in the shelter that women participate in individual therapy, group sessions, and that their children, parenting skills if they have children, and that the children also participate in a children's program. So yes, we begin right away. And those services are what really provide the scaffolding to move on. And we are actively trying to raise funds so that when the 30 to 60 day period is over, we can move women into, or men, into apartments. And we believe, and research confirms this, that when women are able to live independently, a year later, if we can sign a lease for a year and a victim can stay there for a year, they are really on the road to permanent recovery. And the temptation to go back to an abuser is really significant, not just to be with him or her, but because of stability and familiarity. And the children want to see the mom or the dad and the pet, because we don't allow pets in the shelter. And believe it or not, a lot of victims are just really distraught over, well, what is going to happen to the dog? And he'll probably beat the dog now. So yes, we do attempt to really saturate our victims with services to shore them up and allow them to find their own power and resiliency.
What incredible and incredibly important work. And I'm just having such an emotional reaction to when you mentioned the pet and the dog example too. And that's something I'm just mentioning this because in our sort of work around bereavement and just the idea of like the people and potentially animals that you build close relationships with that help you relieve your own distress, it just strikes me as sort of another form of that isolation sort of after, if you've then lost that creature that was helping you cope with that circumstance that you were in, right? So at that point, it's like if you have sort of placed that like relief of distress onto this animal, and then you're not able to have access to that animal for very real reasons and everything else, I'm just thinking that that could feel again like a little bit of that isolation piece just sort of carrying on with you. And I had never considered that in this context. And so I just think the work y'all are doing is so important. And it makes me just wonder too, sort of in this context of the kind of work that Andy's doing, and in more couples where it hasn't turned to the point where someone has actively left, is there anything that you're sort of wishing, or that your organization maybe is wishing, that was studied more within these kinds of couples who maybe have violence going either one direction or both directions? And I'm just curious from your perspective, where you're actually really seeing these couples or the aftermath of these couples, sort of what you wish we knew more in the lead up.
Our mission statement is to end the cycle of domestic violence. So we really focus on education and teen violence. So we're trying to just regress it a bit. And we do a lot of work with schools. So I am keenly interested in how to alleviate, number one, how to alleviate the PTSD that children are experiencing, and therefore break the cycle, because children that witness any kind of abuse are much more likely to be perpetrators or victims in their adulthood. So really children are a big focus. I'd also really be interested in general societal corporate levels of awareness around intimate partner violence, and so those things, because I think education is really the answer to all of that.
That is such a good answer. And what you just said just sparked something in me, again, because we do bereavement stuff. So I think a lot about just what bereavement leave looks like. And I think that that's another piece, what you're sort of saying, of just sort of organizational and like structural awareness and sort of availability for a woman or a person to build that support network back up, and their self-esteem and everything else. And I would imagine there is not that kind of support or like freedom or time off built into many organizations. So a lot of the time you're choosing to either work through while you are, and not choosing, but needing to, right, to make an income, to work through work at the same time that you're having to completely rebuild your whole life. And what an extra level of stress that is. So I think your point just there around sort of organizational support and understanding and just knowledge, I think that piece of education, both for children and all the way up, is really important.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yes.
As you were talking too, I've actually run into like this thoughts as well of like, how do we just kind of increase awareness about it? Because like I said earlier on, like it's prevalent. It's within the communities. And you know, what's the most digestible way to present that to the community and to get conversations about it going is something that I kind of hit a wall with a lot of times, because by no means do I want to like say that, you know, IPV is normal, but it's common actually, and it's not healthy, but it happens. How do you bring up that conversation without like an initial kind of knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, I don't want to talk about that? And I think possibly earlier on that's what I was also interested in, with this emotional abuse aspect of, you know, maybe if we just start talking about the names we call each other, or, you know, like, you know, the aspects of emotional abuse that might be easier to talk about, as opposed to, you know, intense acts of violence that individuals might be less inclined to have an open conversation about. I don't know, what do you think about making that conversations happen more, I guess, increasing that awareness? Because that's something I've been kind of stuck on.
I think that's a really good idea. And I think that there would be avenues for such conversations. I think that I don't know what kind of an outreach you might envision. But one thing that we've thought about is really meeting with church leaders, because there are, especially where I live, people are affiliated with different congregations. And so I think when pastors or clergy are know what to look for, they may become allies, and even through their education programs. I think this is much more ambitious, but another way to approach this would be, and we're giving that some thought at our shelter, is to not have a hidden shelter. We've thought for years that, and we've been an agency for over 40 years here, and our shelter is hidden. There's barbed wire around it. Women and men don't come to the shelter. We house them separately, but women are always escorted to the shelter by law enforcement. And so some of the neighbors in that neighborhood have an idea of what's happening there. But if the shelters were conspicuous and in the middle of a city, for example, and they had the ability to keep clients safe while having walk-ins for information or for educational activities, workshops. If the doors were open, it could be more of a mainstream activity and service than the way it is right now. It's not a sexy topic, abuse, whether it's emotional or financial or physical, and people shy away from it. So I think we need to move it into more of a mainstream position.
It is sort of blowing my mind because of the model, how it's always been like that. And it really speaks to this idea that even though we're talking about individuals, they're sort of like these isolated people, but they are, the nature of the problem is partly isolation, and yet, but they're not. And if it's so stigmatized, and we so other, like you were saying earlier, the people who stay or who continue to be in these relationships and doing things to make them less those people and more it's our people, it's us.
Yeah.
And that also speaks to what you were saying, Andy, before, with the prevalence and the vulnerability that really almost anybody has if they don't have the skills and maybe the support to avoid these difficult, unsafe behaviors, unhealthy behaviors. So
that was definitely one of my biggest takeaways from today, was just, I really liked what Andy was saying, and Debbie as well, just around sort of the need for education, but also just that idea that it can be common but not normal, and we can know that these things are not healthy even if they are common. And I think that is, like, it takes you a second, right, to like get that, but what you're saying, Andy, is so important, right, of like, it is something that we need to talk about because it is so common, even if we don't want to label it as a normal phenomenon, because we don't want that to be seen as like condoning it, because it is common, we need to be talking about it. And I really like that distinction of common but not normal.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We could go on, but we did promise to sort of wrap things up within a reasonable amount of time. And I know that I've learned a lot in this conversation, and I hope that each of you have as well. If there's anything else that you want to share before we go, that would be great. We just appreciate this so much, and your time and your insights are really so significant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you for hosting. I think it's really a very obviously significant, important topic, and has societal implications. And I'm really impressed with your work, Andy, and would love to stay in touch and and see the results of the next study.
Absolutely. No, thank you again for having me here, and it absolutely has been a pleasure meeting you, Dr. Easterling. And I have just so many ideas after these conversations. I'd absolutely love to keep in touch. And also, I think these sessions are extremely helpful. We have these conversations about what this means about, like I said, this is happening in communities that we are living in right now. But I guess these avenues of getting this research out here, I think, is one of the most important things as far as disseminating this work. So yeah, thanks for doing it.
Yeah, we promise to do that, and we'll try to be creative and really share this as widely as possible, especially to all these different avenues that you guys were recommending. So we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.